All right. Well, I think as folks start rolling in here, I'll get a chance. Feel free to ask any questions as I move along here. But overall, appreciate the time. I'll keep it relatively brief here and light as we talk about a pretty dense topic in and itself with respect to energy costs as we brew the product that we all enjoy just about daily here. So before I get started, my name is Zack Hallock. I am a senior energy services advisor with Competitive Energy Services. What we do is sort of energy procurement and advising consulting services. So day to day, really being in tune with the energy markets and how that impacts end users of energy. Personally, I work across a wide variety of customers, but definitely have a soft spot for the brewers out there, especially given the last couple years in the industry. So, with a lot of optimism, looking out over the next couple years, with some opportunity for cost savings measures, whether it's locally on site, the low hanging fruit, or potentially some of the sort of fancier, less out of the box products that exist in the energy procurement world. I guess a big component of that is where you are physically in the world, whether you're deregulated or regulated markets. But I will get into that a little bit later. So looking at our agenda on the day here, folks, really just wanted to highlight that we are looking at just some basics on the markets, what's driving your energy costs from a market perspective, and really what are your options when it comes to those opportunities to make some action and utilize those levers to control costs. Some more on-site and cost savings opportunities. Like I mentioned, the energy procurement itself. I'll describe a little bit how that process functions, and really how we see a lot of sort of my customers and my partners taking advantage here. Obviously, demand management and sort of avoiding expensive times of the year or even down to a daily occurrence. Talk a little bit about that. Auditing bills and performance, understanding, what is the information my bills are telling me. In fact, there's a lot on your utility bills that can be useful in avoiding costs as you look out to the future, particularly in the summertime. And then I'll sort of cap it off with a little bit more of an all-inclusive renewable energy purchasing. Those are sort of more of the unique products that not everybody has an appetite for, but frankly, a lot of it can be done on a relatively cost-effective basis. I'll wrap it up for discussion questions, but please, if something comes up in the chat, I've got my eyes peeled and more than happy to go on a quick detour here. So again, I'll just sort of cap it off or start us off here with energy markets and really how you educate yourself, monitor, and really set yourself up for success. So obviously, electricity is the big part of the conversation here, but really you have to think about what's generating the electricity for my region and how is that going to impact my expenditures as I look to see what's going on in the world. Conflict in other parts of the world certainly have a knock-on effect for us here in the United States. So just an example from somewhere like New England, just 20 years ago, we were a pretty heavy oil and coal part of the country in terms of our electricity generation, very similar to a vast majority of the country at the time. Similar to other parts of the country, we've transitioned heavily from coal and oil to leveraging natural gas. No surprise, US has made itself a natural gas champion of the world, between fracking or other creative methods here. And really, what we're doing is we're setting ourselves up to be the number one player in what's going to be and what I mean really already is a global energy commodity. 30 years ago, we knew oil was a global energy commodity, natural gas, not so much. And I'm here to tell you, natural gas is definitely on its way if you don't consider it already. Understanding that, nuclear, shutdowns across the country, continuing, just with bad PR, frankly, to, continuing to lose out on these capacity auctions and these new, capacity build outs in lieu of natural gas. And I would, at least acknowledge that we have a lot of renewables coming online across the country, but natural gas really runs the show here for electricity pricing. So look into a couple other parts of the country. There still is a lot of coal and oil. It's not so much oil out there anymore, but still certainly a good amount of coal, particularly down south and in the mid-Atlantic. But the key point here being natural gas, even outside of New England, is still the number one, still the number one fuel. It's often called the marginal fuel because it's effectively setting the price of electricity in these regions as well. So, understanding, what's driving the natural gas marketplace, both regionally but also nationally, is how you're really going to be at the leading edge in understanding where are my electricity costs going. Obviously, certain parts of the world, I just think about, like Colorado, for example. Excel has that's a regulated market, regulated utility. They've got a great, handful of programs to not only get cheaper power, but also to get green power. I just happen I really show just deregulated markets here. So I just don't want the point to be lost that if you're in a regulated market where you don't have the choice of a third party energy supplier, that you can actually still choose something that works for your individual needs. So, looking at natural gas, I won't go too into the weeds here from a pricing perspective, but with our natural gas, really the key thing to look at is natural gas storage. Effectively, what we're seeing here on the graph is the blue line is a 12-month rolling strip, which really says for every data point you see here, the gas curve is looking out 12 months into the future. Again, we're just looking back over the last couple years, and it's no surprise that gas was absolutely haywire back in 2022. I mean, we all saw that higher energy rates at home, last winter, 2 winters ago, brutally expensive just to keep the house relatively warm, I guess, depending on where you are in the country. But the simple fact is, a lot of folks were experiencing that pain firsthand. The big reason, we had no storage inventories for natural gas, and any gas that we were getting, we were liquefying and we were sending it overseas to the European market, given they very quickly had less than no gas supply from Russia, which was the primary source of natural gas and a decent source of oil for the European continent. So we made it throughout calendar 22 in a very storage deficit environment, very high prices. As we got through winter and realized there's not a whole lot of heating demand out there in the world, we decided, or we didn't decide, we realized, okay, if we keep drilling, we'll refill our storage inventories and bring prices back down to reality. All things considered, gas is relatively cheap. $3 for a 12-month rolling strip is a solid price. And if procure natural gas, this has been a great opportunity to buy. And if you are waiting to procure natural gas, I guess it's a good opportunity to say, what are we really, what am I waiting for here? But again, this is all driving electricity pricing. This is a good way to use as a proxy for where you think those electricity rates are going to go. Looking a little bit further out in time, again, that was just a 12-month look. I'm looking out till calendar year 24, 25, and 26. And what we're seeing is there's actually not that big of a discount if you look out over the course of 3 years to where we were at in the highs of calendar 22. It's just the near term is relatively cheap. The fact that we've seen pricing for the outer years, basically 25 and 26, remain relatively strong at, I'll call it just $4 generically, that tells us that gas is likely to increase here unless we get some major movement, i.e., some major supply answers for those outer years. So There's definitely a lot of time between now and January of 2025 when we first start seeing those that calendar 25 strip hit the market. But in all reality, we're looking at definitely an increase of natural gas prices over the next 12 months. Again, resolutions with the Russian-Ukraine conflict could certainly help us. A really mild winter that could help us. But in all reality, the reason why we're seeing strength in the market that far out is the fact that the U.S. is poised to continue our LNG exports, which is going to keep that market, it's just going to keep demand high for U.S. producers. So I think with that, I'll take a pause on the pricing, get a little bit out of the weeds, and sort of go back to holistically. That all of these market curves at NYMEX are really sort of the nationally traded commodity of natural gas, priced off the New York Mercantile Exchange, and this is really what everyone looks at when they talk about what is the price of natural gas. But there's another component here that a lot of folks A don't know about and B frankly forget, which is basis. And basis is the proxy to get that gas from the wellhead, where it's drilled to your local gas distribution network, but more importantly, to your local electricity producers. And basis is something that everybody has to deal with, and it's priced as a component of your gas supply and also has a heavy hand at that, on your electricity pricing, the degree of variability being where you are in the world or in the country. The US has clearly said if liquefied natural gas is going to become a part of this global natural gas commodity phenomenon, then we are going to be the number one exporter here. And that's pretty clear in the fact that in just the last couple years, we've added Freeport as a major addition to our export capacity. But we've also got three more projects expected to bring our total export capacity up to 20 BCF per day. Right now, that's about 20% of what we produce on a daily average. Right now, we're producing anywhere between 95 and 100 billion cubic feet per day. And right now, we're only liquefying about 10 to 12% of that. So, increasing that to 20% really, or 25% even, really just tells us we are going to continue to see the U.S. keep the pressure on domestic production. So if you're just joining us, I've gotten pretty granular here, but just as a quick recap, anticipation of continued strong U.S. exports, particularly in liquefied natural gas, are leading to strong futures pricing environment for natural gas, which is very likely leading to higher electricity costs on a prolonged basis for a vast majority of ratepayers. For those in New England, it's pretty significant. For other markets like ERCOT or PJM, again, Mid-Atlantic down in Texas, we may not see as big of an impact, but it's still certainly going to be significant. Understanding when are the opportunities to avoid the significant increases is one of the best ways to make sure that you're not entering an electricity supply contract or any supply contract for that matter, at the height of the market. You don't need to you don't need to lock in on the single lowest day in a 3-year period. But if you can hit the bottom 10% of the market, that's still a great way to avoid costs. So that's sort of holistic market perspective. Just doing a quick time check here, looking okay. Definitely going to shift gears here and work towards some more on-site cost reduction opportunities, really around commodity procurement. So, understanding your usage profile, how much and throughout the day, how am I using energy? And I'm going to say a lot of this with the framework of electricity in mind, because frankly, after the raw materials, we all know electricity is pretty much the biggest line item in our monthly expenditure. So any way we can reduce not just seasonal variability, but contract over contract variability, that's what keeps us from having to eat unexpected costs. So knowing what those risk factors are and really identifying, out of these risk factors, what are my opportunities, not so much to make money, but to avoid getting whacked with high price, sections sectioning off certain types of contracts where we don't have everything renewing at the same time, exploring differences between long-term hedges and short-term, what's called the spot market. All of these, basically different perspectives on how to fix your energy costs. Really, it really depends on what you are as the end user. How do you track that? Well, you monitor the market. I mean, I sort of chuckle when I say it that simply, but if you're not currently monitoring the energy market or your local energy markets at least on a monthly basis, then and I'm not talking a full, audit hour long debrief here, but just having a sense of, what's coming down the pipe from a regulatory perspective can help avoid a lot of heartache down the road. Having a process, when it comes to the procurement, you need to be able to not only do something reliably, but you need to be able to repeat it. So, simply put, you have to be data driven, knowing your account numbers, the number of accounts, the usage, the demand, what's the renewable energy makeup of my electricity supply, or do I have one? Do I even need to care about it? Honestly, these questions for everybody doesn't really make sense to need to address. However, at the end of the day, most of the markets are working towards offering these green and quote renewable products and knowing, what is the true cost to green my electricity supply. Because frankly put, most of us are taking, what's called brown power, which is just a standard, mostly natural gas, some nuke, depending where you are, some coal, some hydro, and that changes your quote unquote, renewable energy makeup right out of the gate. So being data driven, defining a strategy with that data, running a competitive sort of, objective bid process typically is how it goes. At least it's how it should go. Reverse auctions do work in a certain extent. However, in our experience, the lowest price isn't always the best price. I mentioned regulatory components earlier. A lot of suppliers in these deregulated markets are leaving variable aspects to their rates where they can pass through change in law clauses. Again, not anything we want to see. These energy costs need to stay fixed as best we can, aside from just straight up usage deviations from what we anticipate. Not only that, post contract management. You have a billing issue, you got to address it, you got to follow up. These suppliers are often relatively easy to work with. However, you've got to know the right people to ask. Having trusted advisors, with this process certainly helps. But objectively, always happy to bestow, a process like this onto somebody else so they can, continue to basically succeed for their business by mitigating these commodity costs. Getting into the weeds with contract details, again, this is really geared towards a deregulated market where you're able to pick your third party energy suppliers. But it's important to stay on top of contract language with regulatory components as well. So, really understanding, what are some potential penalties, really looking out for the, what we call are the gotcha clauses in a lot of these contracts. So for those just joining us, just a quick recap, really highlighting the value of commodity procurement as one of the main cost reduction strategies, having a cycle and a process that you can repeat and build relationships with is absolutely the way to go when it comes to this commodity procurement. Then I'm going to shift gears a little bit here to talk demand management. This is something that's a little bit more specific to deregulated markets. Again, because there's just so many options, it's trying to distill 100 things down into 10 useful things. And demand management is probably the easiest thing to wrap your head around. Basically, at every part of the U.S. electrical grid experiences peak demand. Typically speaking, for electric utilities, the highest demand hours are the most expensive hours out of the year for them. It's when the equipment's running its hottest, it's when it's most likely to fail, and critical failures are how you get your brownouts, your blackouts. Because above all else, the US electrical grid is predicated on reliability. Price certainty and affordability is certainly a part of it, but reliability is how we've structured our electrical grid. When we get to those peak moments, these utilities are they're so expensive that they're willing to pay people money to shed their electrical demand during certain hours by their signal so that they can try to be a more efficient utility and serve that reliable power. That's simply put demand management, shedding load during the stressful times of the year. Typically speaking, it's in the summer, in the end of the day when ACs are cranked, people are getting home from work. Really, those are the moments in time when the grid says, Uncle, I need some help. So, independent system operators, ISOs, and regional transmission operators, RTOs, operate these wholesale markets, which really, capacity as the third item is that reliability component. So as I said, peak hours of the year, those peak demand, seasonality. Eventually, some parts of the U.S. grid are going to start to experience these stressful hours as people start to adopt electric heat. And so that's another component that we see coming down the pipe. That's 10, 20 years down the road, especially depending on where you are in the country. May not be as Again, I'm a little biased. I'm coming from the Boston area, so for me, it's winter is the real deal. My uncle down in Florida, he may not care as much. So, anyways, um, having a demand management plan. How can I get compensated for this? Is there more that I can do to participate? Typically speaking, if it's a predictable time of day and a predictable time of year, if you can, adjusting operations just a few hours can really save you a boatload of cash in the terms of, five figures, depending on your operations, upwards of six figures. I mean, some of the largest manufacturers in the country that do demand management are pulling high six-figure dollar amounts in revenue out of these formal programs. So anyways, they do exist all over the country. If you have questions, please do reach out. I'll be displaying my contact info shortly here, but just wanted to get that on the radar as probably the lowest hanging fruit with respect to cost avoidance opportunities. I mentioned audit and analysis earlier. Really speaking to the notion that you've got to know what your final costs are going to look like over the next fiscal year. Generally speaking, in New England, and which really is representative of utilities across the country, they're passing through what are called rate cases, effectively annual filings with the local ISO or RTO to say, hey, I need to pass through higher rates to make sure that I'm not going out of business as a utility. Deregulated utilities, investor-owned utilities are not in the business of making money, and so they do what they can to stay afloat and therefore passing through the cost to maintain this reliable grid. It is not cheap by any means to keep the grid just as reliable as we expect it to be. So understanding down to individual rate codes. We've got an example here, and effectively looking to show, what we have, and really, the way you should be thinking about, how can I really dig into the details of my utility? Tracking and monitoring. You don't have to get too fancy, simple Excel workbook or all the way up to an integrated, module in Tableau or something like that. And you can get some pretty clear telemetry on your energy costs. Again, it's one of the largest line items in your monthly expenditures. So why not spend a little bit of extra time seeing what we can do to manage? And so this is just a kind of a good example of something that we look at for our current customers that would be very easy to sort of rinse and repeat and sort of distribute this type of reporting and this type of strategy. Whether it's getting invoice data or just manually tracking the data ourselves or pulling it directly integrated with the utility, there's a bunch of things you can do here. So, anyways, I just want people to realize it really isn't too much effort to manage these costs and to really get ourselves into the mindset of, we should review this a couple times a year. So as we look for our next year, sort of playbook, I'm not worried about the big bad what if. What if Middle Eastern conflict creates a volatile energy market? It helps you really get through the night without having to wake up and stress about it. So again, this goes back to the low hanging fruit with auditing, tracking, monitoring, and really understanding, the DNA of what makes up your energy expenditure. All right. I think that's a good summary on demand management. So shifting gears a little bit to external funding. Uh, Tori, can you please close the door here? So looking at external funding, one thing that is important to identify is, what kind of external funding? What degree? Are we just looking for utility incentives? Are we looking for state incentives, independent? Or are we going straight up to, what can I get out of the U.S. government? So with that in mind, uh, I wanted to take a minute to talk about the Inflation Reduction Act, something that we've definitely all at least heard of. I mean, understanding this really is a game changer per se, with respect to, funding for these renewable energy projects. At a high level, I think most people have heard about the 30% ITC investment tax credit for energy projects. There's a long list of what's defined as an energy project, but generally speaking, it encompasses a lot. If you want to learn more, please reach out. Again, I'll have my information here shortly. But at the end of the day, wanted to make people aware that, for these standalone battery storage projects or solar wind, we basically have a 10-year window starting, at the beginning of 2023. And this is going to allow us to leverage, basically a decade of discounted costs here or additional funding out of the government. We still need a couple things defined for us to be able to, consistently have a roadmap on how to leverage this. But, there's adders here. That's supply. That's an additional 10% on that investment tax credit. I mean, I guess at the end of the day, having the tax liability helps. But again, it's a little bit into the weeds. If you're in an energy community, again, there's posted on the government website. There's an additional 10% adder there. I think the big thing though for breweries is sort of the electric vehicle credits and extended and expanded. We don't really necessarily have a large fleet, but if people want to see that, we're trying to be sustainable and we're getting EV units outside of our facilities, we're definitely encouraging, that new age of vehicles here. And so, the big thing is if you have to be, a tax-free entity, there's a new direct pay provision for non-taxable entities, effectively a way for tax-free entities to leverage this. Given that, I just mentioned it's an investment tax credit, tax liability. It's completely new and it's very unique. But either way, there's definitely a good set of opportunities for us for external funding. So that was a little bit of a high level, Inflation Reduction Act. I mentioned utilities. Depending on where you are, they may still have a decent amount of funding. I will say a lot of the funding post COVID has kind of dried up. So we are seeing a little bit of a lack of utility efficiency dollars there. I'm thinking the HVAC, retro commissioning, the lighting, again, sort of going back to the low hanging fruit separate from the contract and invoice. So a little bit larger scale, bigger picture, renewable purchasing opportunities. I will say most of these are going to be, framed from the perspective of, what can I do from a procurement perspective? So folks in regulated industries, like I mentioned earlier, Colorado, you may not have as many opportunities here, but if you're curious, definitely quickly distill down, a bunch of dynamic markets across the country to your specific. So, generally speaking, we've got our procurement pathways for renewables. Now, when you say renewable energy, the first thing you want to think about is it bundled or unbundled? And what do I mean by that? Is the energy that we're getting bundled with the renewable attribute that is being generated. So for solar and wind, for every megawatt hour, which is 1,000 kilowatt hours, is basically it's for every certain amount of volume of renewable energy that's purchased, you have the kilowatt hours, the energy itself, and the renewable attribute, i.e., the renewable energy credit. When I say bundled or unbundled, it's important to consider, do you want those things together or are you willing to get them separate? You can get the renewable attributes of solar generation without actually having the solar kilowatt hours on site. And those would be the unbundled products. Generically speaking, those are your voluntary rec. Again, the renewable energy credit is the renewable aspect of the renewable energy generation. When you unbundle them, you're just getting the RECs, the renewable attribute itself. So, every state has its own compliance RECs, and some states are more aggressive. Generically, California, New York, Massachusetts are some of the more aggressive, compliance markets in the country. But there are also a ton of voluntary programs for every single state that's out. So looking at our generically our less complex, cheaper, less risky products, the unbundled is the way to go. It's what most people think about and what most people refer to when they say they are a green, supply or a green brewery. Often they're just buying these RECs and saying, "Hey, I'm offsetting the environmental impact of my quote brown power that I mentioned earlier, and I'm saying I want to green it up by buying these voluntary or compliance RECs." It's a fantastic tool to use. Not everybody knows about it, and so just wanted to reiterate that for relatively cheap costs, you can make claims that we are 100% green electricity, or we are the equivalent to. It's a little bit of nuanced in the wording, but generally speaking, it gives you a chance to say, hey, I made the financial commitment to create a healthier environment for generations after us, and I want to be able to put that, somewhere on our website, on their sign on the front door. Heck, you could even stamp the bottle and get the label right on there. So those are typically the more accessible and like I said, the cheaper, less risky products. When you talk about bundled products, it's first important to think, is this something that I'm going to have on site or off site? If it's on site, it's pretty much going to be a land array, a rooftop array, something like that that's going to directly offset. And what I'm referring to are our DG projects, the orange one kind of right here in the middle of our bundle. Again, the renewable energy, the renewable attribute are bundled together. Taking that solar energy, it's basically the gold standard to say, hey, I am investing in the renewable asset and I am claiming the renewable component of this generation. There's other products where you can get, like I mentioned, with all those electricity supply opportunities, you can bundle specific assets from that supplier and get those green, certificates to say, hey, yes, I am getting solar energy from my supplier XYZ. And not only that, but I can prove that it's renewable with this certificate right here. And so those are usually the utility and supply bundled products. All the way to the left here, and the deepest shade of red, is really the most risky, most complex. However, depending on where you're at, the most financially lucrative. But again, caveat is most risky. The most financially lucrative opportunities: a power purchase agreement (PPA) or a virtual power purchase agreement, a virtual PPA. At high level, you're agreeing to buy renewable energy and the renewable asset from a site, whether it's on site, in region or out of region. So you can subscribe. So me, as someone who's close to Boston, I could subscribe to a solar facility out in, say, Oklahoma, and get the actual renewable components from that project and count it against my own environmental impact. Now, that being said, something like that is quite expensive. However, it's a high degree of confidence that you are doing the right thing. You are putting your best foot forward. Not to say that these unbundled products are bad, but then it sort of comes into the sustainability philosophy of what really is the right thing. Am I just buying these offsets to sort of wash myself of my environmental impact, or am I technically doing the right thing to have a sustainable portfolio, particularly with my energy supply? Frankly, to each your own. But at the end of the day, there are markets for these voluntary recs. You can go that route and still properly claim yourself. You just may get some people that are, getting into the weeds on a technical basis that may, want to have that conversation. But at the end of the day, you're still committing to something. You're doing a lot more than what other end users of energy are doing, not just in the brewery industry, but across a vast majority of industries. So I would say, generally speaking, this is sort of the big catch-all. If you have plans to expand, it's definitely a good way to sort of hedge against future energy cost increases. And if you're looking to really understand a little bit more, please, please, please do reach out. More than happy to get more than happy to have a side conversation and just provide advice, because frankly, that's what we do here at Competitive. So I think with that, I'll leave the last sort of 5 minutes here, recognizing time. For any questions or comments, please feel free to reach out here and we can take it from there. And I'll leave my contact info up on the side here. If anybody would like to reach out, please don't hesitate to drop me a line.